So Civil War Frontline issue number 10 is one of the final two tie-ins of the Civil War event, and what we'll see is that this comic book really takes place before the events of Civil War issue number 7, but as it progresses, it will actually pick up during the events of Civil War issue number 7. And what we see is that Sally Floyd is meeting with Miss Marvel, and that Miss Marvel has met with Sally Floyd to simply set the record straight. And what we learn here is that Miss Marvel is actually the individual, the liaison for S.H.I.E.L.D. that has been passing information to both Sally Floyd and the NYPD. And what we see is that Miss Marvel confirms with Sally Floyd that someone has been, involved on the inside with altering the programming of Norman Osborn. She says that she has a condensed record of the modifications that were made to Norman Osborn's nanite controllers, and that she was helping Reed Richards determine what time these nanite controllers were activated and who it was that had access to Norman Osborn during these times. In addition, we get a flashback to just after the meeting between Tony Stark and Reed Richards about the possibility of a traitor and the identity of this traitor. And what we see is that Tony Stark informs his immediate team that there is a traitor within their midst, and that after analyzing Norman Osborn's samples before and after he was detained and was released, that someone had made modifications to this. Now, initially, the question from Miss Marvel is who this individual is, but Tony Stark says that they've identified who this individual is, but because of reasons of national security, that Tony Stark can't tell them. From here, we see that Hank Pym freaks out, and he begins to scream at Tony Stark and tells Tony Stark that they've been with him since the beginning, and that there's really no reason why Tony Stark should not be able to tell them that Hank Pym feels like if anyone has earned the trust of Tony Stark, it's been these immediate individuals that have been with him and at his side since the beginning of Civil War. From here, we transition back to the meeting with Sally Floyd and Miss Marvel, and Miss Marvel says that they didn't say who this individual was, that they didn't say who the particular traitor was. What we also see is that Sally Floyd begins to sort of question what's going on here. She says it doesn't make sense. Why would Tony Stark and Reed Richards confirm the existence of a traitor within S.H.I.E.L.D. and then not tell anybody who the traitor is? And she goes as far as to speculate whether or not it could be Robert Reynolds the Sentry, and that it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would they even suggest that there would be a reason for someone to conspire with Norman Osborn? Miss Marvel says that there really isn't a reason for this, and she can't think of anybody on their side that would conspire with Norman Osborn, but then says that she has to leave in order to keep her cover from being blown. From here, we see that Sally Floyd looks at the envelope, the piece of paper that had been given to her, and is stunned to see that it is really just that simple, that this piece of information has revealed to her the person who is behind the tampering of Norman Osborn's nanites. From here, we see her contact Ben Urich, and she says that she has stumbled across a large piece of information involving Tony Stark, which of course tells us that Tony Stark appears to have been the person, the hidden hand behind the adjustment to Norman Osborn's nanite programming. But what we also see is that Ben Urich intends to tell Sally Floyd about his findings involving the stock market adjustments that have been made and the financial gains that Tony Stark has made since the beginning of the Civil War event. The two of them agree to meet at Times Square by 6 o'clock, but Ben Urich adjusts this time and says that he will meet her at 6:15 as there's something that he needs to do first. From here, we see that Ben Urich arrives at the Daily Bugle and interrupts an editorial meeting between J. Jonah Jameson and Robbie Robertson. And what we see is that Ben Urich tells J. Jonah Jameson that he has stumbled across what may very well be the biggest story to have ever been uncovered by anybody at the newspaper. But because of the fact that the Daily Bugle is not set up for the potential ramifications, both legally and financially, for publishing this article, Ben Urich is putting in his immediate resignation. He is quitting his job on the spot. And the reason for this is because Ben Urich feels torn. Ben Urich is kind of in a position where he wants to ensure this story gets published. He wants to ensure this story is put out there, or at the very least, that the information is made available. But he doesn't want to do it in a way that would jeopardize the Daily Bugle financially and legally. And so we see that Robbie Robertson attempts to assuage Ben Urich from quitting, but then we see that J. Jonah Jameson cuts off Robbie Robertson and tells him to be quiet. And then he tells everyone except for Ben Urich to leave. Once everybody's out of the room, we see that J. Jonah Jameson says he understands Ben's position, that Ben is a fine reporter, and that he understands when someone has made up their mind. From here, we see that Ben Urich and J. Jonah Jameson part ways, and J. Jonah Jameson is sad to see that Ben Urich is leaving. At this point, we transition back to Tony Stark, and what we see is that Tony Stark is watching a news broadcast where the report is of a swell, a sort of upsurge in terms of the mobilization of Atlanteans along the Atlantic coast, but that there's no real no real way to determine the size of this particular force or just how much power this force has. And the question that's being asked here, and the sort of argument that's being produced here, is that Tony Stark has pushed the United States towards a conflict with Atlantis by virtue of allowing the Green Goblin loose, and then the Green Goblin engaging in attacks against the Atlanteans. And we of course see that Reed Richards speaks with Tony Stark for a minute and tells Tony Stark that he had chose this road, he had chose this path, and to stay the course, presuming that it'll probably all work out in the end. From here, we switch to Times Square at around 6:15 p.m., and we see that Ben Urich is meeting with Sally Floyd. And as the two of them are getting ready to exchange information, we then pick up with the events of Civil War issue number 7, where the conflict between Captain America's forces and Iron Man's forces has spread to the streets of New York City. And we see various individuals, such as Venom and Daredevil, as well as Radioactive Man and others, engaging in conflict with one another. We see that there are a multitude of explosions in the background, all sorts of damage is being done, and as a result, Typeface is presumed to have been killed in the conflict. We also see that Ben Urich and Sally Floyd head for the subway station to sort of take refuge against all the conflict and all the action and the explosions that are going on. And after the two of them are able to catch their breath and they are assuming they're in a safe location, they exchange information. And what they learn is that both of them have come to the same conclusion. And we see that Ben Urich tells Sally Floyd that he believes that he knows the real reasons behind the entire Civil War event. From here, we transition to Robbie Baldwin at Cumberland Federal Correctional Institute. And what we see here is that Robbie Baldwin is actually meeting with the individual that had shot him. Robbie Baldwin's not being held here, and Robbie Baldwin has actually been released. But the individual that had shot him is, of course, the father of one of the children that had been killed in Stamford, Connecticut. And initially, he's under the impression that he's going to be questioned and he demands an attorney, but once he enters the room, he realizes he's going to be meeting with Robbie Baldwin. From here, we see a great segment in the comic whereby this father begins to scream at Robbie Baldwin and tells Robbie Baldwin that his wife had died years ago and the only person he really had left in his life was his daughter, and now she's been taken away from him, and the only thing he has left in his life is his hatred for Robbie Baldwin. But for the most part, Robbie Baldwin really has no sympathy for this individual, because the actions of this man have led to Robbie Baldwin being in a position where he constantly has bullet shrapnel pressing against the nerves in his spine, and so as a result, he's in pain 24 hours a day. And so what we see is that Robbie Baldwin meets with a man after burning his costume, burning his old speedball costume, and this man is presumably building or has built a new suit for Robbie Baldwin. And this new suit is a very grotesque and torturous looking kind of suit. This suit is filled with a multitude of various spikes, some of which are longer than others. And what we see here is that the initial impression on behalf of this individual who has built this suit is that this suit is going to be used to torture someone. This suit is going to be used to inflict a massive amount of pain on somebody else. And when he asks who this individual is supposed to be, who this individual is that Robbie Baldwin intends to inflict so much pain on, Robbie Baldwin says that it's going to be he himself. From here, the suit maker decides that he doesn't want to have any part of this, that he doesn't want to be involved in this. And Robbie Baldwin says that either you can help me with this or I can end your life. And so this man ends up helping Robbie Baldwin put the suit on. The suit itself actually has 612 spikes. These spikes will dig directly into the body of Robbie Baldwin, and they will cause extreme physical pain. and 60 of these spikes are longer than the other ones. The 612 spikes represent the total number of people who were killed in Stamford, Connecticut, and the 60 spikes that are longer than the others represent the 60 children that were killed in Stamford, Connecticut. But what we see is that as a result of this extreme physical pain that Robbie Baldwin has put himself through, that his powers are now under his control, telling us that his powers only manifest when his body is in extreme physical pain, when extreme external stimuli has really kind of stimulated the powers that he has developed so far. And we see that Robbie Baldwin changes his name, and that he's no longer considering himself to be Robbie Baldwin. He's no longer considering himself to be Speedball, that he has changed his name to Penance. So Civil War Frontline issue number 11 brings an end to the main Civil War conflict, that is to say, the events that have been bubbling up to the ultimate conflict between Captain America and Iron Man. And the way this story is told, I would go as far as to say, makes it one of the absolute best stories ever told in Marvel Comics, and probably one of the best comic books that I've ever read in Marvel Comics. The story picks up after the events of the conflict, the fight between Captain America's forces and Iron Man's forces, and the surrender of Captain America. And the story is told from the perspective, again, of Sally Floyd and Ben Urich. And what we see here is that after the event's over, after everything is all said and done, that everybody begins to come out of hiding. All the normal civilians, all the unpowered individuals come out of hiding and attempt to figure out what all's going on. And then we see the total devastation that was wrought at the hands of these superheroes as they engaged in this final battle of the Civil War. And what we see is that for the most part, a large portion of Manhattan is devastated. It's not necessarily totally obliterated, but there's enough damage to be going on with. And from here, we switch back to listening to either Sally Floyd or Ben Urich describe what's going on here, describe this perspective, the view of these events from the perspective of your normal, average, everyday person. And the reality here, the understanding, and I guess the decision that people have come to is that something has to change. Something needs to be done here. That all this conflict really did is underscore the necessity for the Superhuman Registration Act. It was to underscore the need for superhumans to somehow not necessarily have their personal identities made public, but for there to be some way that superheroes have to be held accountable. Because this very instance could very well mark the beginning of a much darker future for the world. That if superheroes are allowed to remain unchecked, if those individuals who remain underground as part of the anti-registration movement continue to come into conflict with those who are in support of the superhuman registration, then it's going to produce more conflicts just like these. It's going to produce more problems just like these. In addition, we see that either Sally Floyd or Ben Urich is talking to us about how when Captain America had surrendered, that either superheroes were rounded up, the remaining superheroes were rounded up by S.H.I.E.L.D. and Iron Man's forces, or they simply ran away. And we see that for the most part, history, as she says it, will say that people dodged a bullet, that the American citizenry and even the world as a whole had dodged a bullet by Captain America effectively surrendering, by the Civil War conflict coming to an end. But Sally Floyd says that there was really no time to ponder this concept. There was really no time to think about this because they were too busy trying to put out fires, too busy trying to focus on getting problems remedied, getting the situation or the city back to a state of normalcy, to really focus on exactly how it is that future generations will view the results of this Civil War conflict. What we also learn here is that the death toll of the fight in Manhattan was 53 people, and only 6 of them were superpowered people. Now, this is extremely important when it comes to the Civil War conflict, because for the most part, both sides, at least for the brunt of the conflict, were fighting on behalf of what they thought was right. But throughout the entire Civil War conflict, there was very little, I guess, recognition or very little credence given to the necessity of ensuring that normal humans stayed safe. And we saw this throughout the entire conflict. We saw this as things progressed, as things became more and more serious. From the time that Nitro self-detonated and destroyed a big portion of Stamford, Connecticut, to the time that we ended this Civil War conflict, we never really saw a lot of discussion on how is this going to affect the average person. How does the average person view this? We knew that a majority of people sided with superhuman registration, but for the most part, the story focused on the superheroes. And that in and of itself is really the defining aspect, really the defining point of the mindset of those who were leading the superhuman and the anti-superhuman registration movement. From here, we see that Sally Floyd and Ben Urich are at the raft at Rikers Island. And of course, as we had previously discussed, the raft is the location where they keep superpowered individuals in order to, provide an adequate form of either security or maybe just attainment for these individuals. And what we see here is that for the most part, Captain America's not that upset. He's not that sorry about his stance regarding the Civil War event. He recognizes that there are some things that he could have done different. He recognizes that there was a possibility that he could have met with Tony Stark and other individuals to really kind of find a peaceful altercation, a peaceful resolution to this entire Civil War event. But instead, he went headstrong and decided to fight on the side of freedom. But for Captain America, he feels as though he fought the right fight. He apologizes over the fact that there was so much damage done, and that to a degree, the perception of him and other superheroes may very well have been betrayed as far as their actions go and how they're viewed by humanity. But at the end of the day, he still stands staunch as a supporter of freedom and believes that he was fighting on the right side. From here, we see that Sally Floyd has had enough, and Sally Floyd absolutely let Steve Rogers have it. And this, I would say, points out the inherent flaw, the fundamental issue with Steve Rogers fighting in the 21st century, despite the fact that he was discovered in the 1960s and a majority of his experience regarding worldwide conflict and war took place during World War II. Sally Floyd says that Captain America has no real understanding of what America is about, that he doesn't understand what America is. She asks him if he knows what MySpace is, because at the time of Civil War, MySpace was still a relatively popular form of social media. And Captain America says he doesn't understand what this line of questioning has to do with anything. Sally Floyd says she understands that, but asks Captain America to bear with her. She asks him who won the World Series last year, or who won American Idol last year. And Captain America is not able to understand any of these questions, or at the very least, he's not able to answer any of these questions. And this is the flaw that Sally Floyd points out, that Captain America, despite the fact that he argues to be on behalf of freedom, that he argues to be on the behalf of the American citizenry, doesn't really know anything about America. And this, again, is the inherent flaw of Captain America. Captain America was a World War II era fighter. He was a fantastic soldier, and he was a great beacon of freedom in the world at the time. But from the 1960s, when Captain America was rediscovered, up until this current point, Captain America never moved on. Captain America never got over the fact that things had changed. When Captain America was fighting in World War II, and even then during the early days when he first reappeared in Marvel Comics, villains for the most part were very basic. They were very unimportant with regards to the world as a whole in terms of what it is they wanted to achieve. Very rarely did you ever find villains that were willing to go to the extreme in order to achieve their goals. Periodically you would, but most villains for the most part were very simple, and they were very basic, and they were very comedic. And this is Marvel's way of telling us that these days are gone, that these things are past. If you recall our discussion on Ultron, we had talked about how the Masters of Evil was really kind of being portrayed as this antiquated form of villainry in Marvel Comics. This really touches on that yet again, that Captain America holds himself to an ideology that is no longer existent, that the days are gone when supervillains are effectively bank robbers, when supervillains are attempting to carry out these laughable goals, that supervillains now are extreme, that supervillains now are willing to kill people, kill multitudes of people in order to achieve their goals. In addition, Sally Floyd talks about how in this day and age, you have superheroes that are far beyond the capabilities of anything that Captain America is capable of doing. That you have superheroes that are so powerful that they are a threat to not just the planet Earth, but the universe as a whole. And that maybe, just maybe, the necessity for a Superhuman Registration Act was there. That, if anything, the conflict between Captain America and Iron Man proved that there is a necessity for some form of superhuman registration, because a superhuman superhumans are allowed to fight one another, and they are allowed to engage in conflict like this, with this kind of destruction, then what would future generations do? What kind of lawlessness would the world be looking at if there's no way to hold superheroes accountable for their actions? From here, we see that Ben Urich and Sally Floyd leave Captain America to his thoughts, and Ben Urich is a little surprised to see that Sally Floyd had taken the stance as she did, that she had been so harsh on Captain America. But Sally Floyd's not very apologetic for it and feels as though these were words that Captain America needed to hear, that either Captain America can step into the 21st century or he's going to become a relic. He's going to become this symbol of an antiquated time in humanity that doesn't really apply to society anymore. From here, we get this sort of montage, and what we had seen was that Sally Floyd and Ben Urich were going to meet with Iron Man 10 days after their meeting with Captain America, and it was a chance for them to gather their information and to present their findings to Tony Stark. And over the course of this 10 days, we learned that Ben Urich and Sally Floyd had, of course, quit their positions with their respective newspapers, and they had started their own news reporting agency called Frontlines.com. We, of course, see that Danny and Sally Floyd are together. We see that the Century, Robert Reynolds, comes out in support of superhuman registration, but we also see that Ben Urich and Sally Floyd still maintain contact with those individuals who are underground, with those individuals that are doing what they can to, I guess, maybe circumvent the goals of the pro-registration movement. What we also see is that, for the most part, society is trying to get things cleaned up. Society is trying to piece things together, but we also learned that there has been about a 38% increase in the number of people who have chosen to register. And the reason for this is because the United States is teetering on the edge of war with the Atlanteans, because the Atlanteans have not forgotten the actions of Norman Osborn at the loading docks. The Atlanteans had not forgotten the actions of Nitro in Stamford, Connecticut, despite the fact that justice had been served on Nitro regarding the fact that he had killed Namorita. We see, of course, that things are still a little shaky, that things are still a little rough, that the amount of security that's being imposed on society as a whole is something more than people had ever expected, despite the fact that it's being imposed on both superheroes, villains, and normal people. We also see, of course, that some of the superheroes, various individuals, gather to offer their condolences and offer their well wishes to those who were killed in the Civil War conflict and are passing on. From here, we see that Sally Floyd and Ben Urich are meeting with Tony Stark, and of course, they state that they have a meeting with Tony Stark when they arrive at Tony's residence. But we also see that Ben Urich tells Sally Floyd to simply stay quiet, that Sally Floyd doesn't need to go on the kind of tirade and the kind of rant that she had gone on when they had met with Captain America. Now, what we see here is effectively a piecing together, the puzzle coming together regarding the actions of Tony Stark during Civil War, because we knew that Tony Stark had engaged in some rather unsavory actions by the time Civil War issue number 7 came around, but we didn't know how all this fit together. We didn't know exactly what it was that he was doing or what the end result of all this was. Now, what we see is that when Ben Urich and Sally Floyd are meeting with Tony Stark says that they are welcome to ask him whatever they want, that he has nothing to hide. And Ben Urich tells Tony Stark to remember that he said that, and Sally Floyd begins with a recap of these Civil War events. Sally Floyd, of course, tells us that 612 people were killed in the incident in Stamford, Connecticut, and that as a result, a dubious bill was proposed to Congress, and it was passed almost overnight, and that individuals that were in violation of this law were hauled off and they were thrown into the negative zone with extremely harsh conditions, despite the fact that so little time had passed that a lot of these superheroes who were debating the merits of the law really had no time to debate it properly. They effectively had to either side with it or go against it, and there was no real chance to argue the merits of whether or not this law was appropriate. What we also see is her telling us that the pro-registration leaders of the superhuman community had gone with releasing various supervillains and intended to use these supervillains as a means to track down superheroes who had refused to register, and that some of these supervillains, specifically Norman Osborn, had somehow gone rogue, and that they had basically committed actions, in effect, attacking the Atlanteans and put the United States on par with almost going to war with the Atlanteans. It really set us down the path to the brink of war with a whole different culture. She goes as far as to say that you wouldn't think it could get any worse, but that Sally Floyd and Ben Urich have uncovered the fact that there is a traitor within the S.H.I.E.L.D. organization. Now, Tony Stark really tries to jump on this and say that there will always be wild exaggerations and rumors, but Ben Urich stops him and says that they have documented proof. They have a schematic that indicates that there was a presence of re-engineered nanites in the blood of Norman Osborn, and that it was put there by person or persons unknown, effectively telling us that someone had altered the nanites in Norman Osborn's body to allow him to operate outside of the parameters that had been specified for all supervillains that were working as part of the Thunderbolts under S.H.I.E.L.D. What we see is Sally Floyd and Ben Urich asking why someone would do that. Why would someone allow themselves or ally themselves with someone as unstable as Norman Osborn and then allow Norman Osborn to effectively go rogue and act within his own accordance? What we see is that Tony Stark says that this is wrong, that there will always be superheroes, or there will always be supervillains, rather, that will attempt to go rogue, but they will never be successful. That, for the most part, the supervillains will always be under control of S.H.I.E.L.D. And then we see that Ben Urich says that he agrees with Tony Stark, that he believes that Tony Stark is right here, and he says the biggest misdirection is the one that hides in plain sight. He says the Green Goblin had never left the control of Tony Stark, that Tony Stark himself is the traitor. And this is when we get the explanation of what was going on with the Green Goblin. Ben Urich goes on to say that the most obvious question was why a man with Osborn's physical strength would use a pistol, as a means to assassinate or attempt to assassinate a member of the Atlantean delegation, because a pistol would really not do anything to damage an Atlantean. The Atlantean physiology is such that they are far beyond what a normal human is able to do. They are more durable, they are stronger, they're faster, and so it wouldn't make any sense that Norman Osborn would choose to use a pistol to attack an Atlantean. In addition, we see how Norman Osborn, having supreme physical strength well beyond a normal person, was subdued by the police. And again, this doesn't make any sense, that Norman Osborn could have easily overpowered the police. Now, what we also see is Ben Urich talking about how when, Norman Osborn was being interviewed by Donna and Keith, who of course were the detectives that we were following during the story of Joe, that every time he tried to tell them what was going on, every time he tried to tell them that someone was controlling him, he would begin foaming at the mouth and he would be unable to do so. And then we get the pieces put together. We get the pieces established for us, and we understand what it was that Tony Stark was doing. That the actions of Nitro, in effect causing the incident at Stamford, Connecticut, set off a chain reaction. And this chain reaction would mean that somewhere along the line, somewhere later on down the line, that eventually people would come into conflict, that the superhero community would be split. And the only way to really stop this, the only way to really keep this from happening was to initiate the entire Civil War event by means of setting up the Superhuman Registration Act, forcing superhumans to register. Now, Tony Stark did not expect that there was going to be so much anti-registration sentiment on behalf of various superheroes. And so to counter for this, he released Norman Osborn and adjusted the programming of Norman Osborn's nanites. With Norman Osborn's nanites programming adjusted, Norman Osborn would now be controlled by Tony Stark. Tony Stark had Norman Osborn attack the Atlanteans. By virtue of the Atlanteans being attacked, the Atlanteans would threaten war against the superhero community and the United States as a whole. And so in response to this, both normal humans and the superhumans, with regards to the idea of going to war with the Atlanteans, would band together for a common goal, and it would effectively end the Civil War. Now, of course, Sally Floyd says that in a very sarcastic way, that she thinks that he did what he did for the greater good, that she applauds him for his actions. But of course, Tony Stark realizes she's being sarcastic, and he tells her to leave. Now, this is a very important part of the Civil War event, and the reason why is because the actions of Tony Stark may be looked at by some people as questionable. They may be looked at by some people as outright heinous, that he effectively manipulated all the events of the Civil War in order to basically band the superhero community together against a common cause by almost bringing the United States as a whole to brink with Atlantis, to war with Atlantis. Tony Stark didn't know if it was going to happen. Tony Stark took a gamble here. Tony Stark rolled the dice, had Norman Osborn attack the Atlanteans, and then hoped the Atlanteans wouldn't immediately attack the United States and go to war with us. And so we see that with Tony Stark here, depending on how you view him as an individual, depending on what your moral compass is, you may say that he's right, that he made the right decision here. He took what was in effect a fractured superhero community and banded the superhero community together against an external cause. He took this perception of humanity's view of superheroes and managed to eliminate this for a moment while everyone banded together against a single cause. But then you could look at Tony Stark and say that Tony Stark is a manipulator, that Tony Stark manipulated circumstances, that there's no real justification for his actions. Now from here, of course, we see that Sally Floyd and Ben Urich leave, and they inform Tony Stark that they are not going to make this public. They are not going to tell anybody what's going on. And this is really an intelligent move on their behalf. And the reason why is because if this information got out, if people learned that the end result of the superhuman movement, the Superhuman Registration Act, came to what it was because Tony Stark had manipulated everything, people would lose faith. People wouldn't believe that they had actually banded together for a good cause. They would look at the current circumstances as a result of manipulation, and they would walk away from this ideology of working together, which of course would most likely set the superhero community right back down the path of open civil war, but also leave the United States open and I guess possibly being able to be conquered by the Atlanteans if the United States as a whole went to war with the Atlanteans. Tony Stark feels guilt-ridden as a result of this. He recognizes that so much destruction has been wrought, that billions of dollars worth of damage have been inflicted on Manhattan as well as various other cities around the United States, that 50 some odd people are now dead, all because he had manipulated things and effectively done what he did for the greater good. From here, we see that the comic book comes to an end, and we're left with this idea, with this question in our heads of, did Tony Stark actually do the right thing? And from here, we bring an end to the story of Civil War. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this whole Civil War series. I had a great time putting it together, and if you guys have any suggestions, any criticisms, any things you guys would like me to do in order to, I guess, maybe look at things from a different perspective, or when it comes to future storylines to make changes, and feel free to let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.